Fame forgives everything until it doesn't. Behind the applause and perfect lighting, some of Britain's brightest stars were slowly unraveling, one drink, one pill, one carefully hidden breakdown at a time. These weren't cautionary tales, they were people. Brilliant, broken, and often betrayed by the very spotlight that made them. This is not a tribute, it's a quiet reckoning. Welcome to 15 Old British Stars Who Were Destroyed by Drugs. A story about what happens when the cameras keep rolling, but the person inside starts to disappear. Before we dive in, if you're drawn to stories that unravel the myths behind fame, hit that subscribe button. We tell the kinds of tales that don't wrap up neatly. And while you're here, where are you watching from? Drop your city in the comments and let us know what time it is where you are. Is this a midnight spiral or just your lunch break turned existential? 1. Oliver Reed. He drank like a myth. He fought like a story you'd tell at a pub right before closing time. And he died, fittingly, in a bar, surrounded by strangers who'd just watched him arm wrestle a group of sailors in Malta. Oliver Reed, the archetypal British hellraiser, didn't just act in films. He inhabited them like a storm rolling through a dinner party. By the time he made it to Gladiator, he was a relic from a cinematic past where chaos was called charisma, and insurance companies were always one drink away from canceling your contract. Reed's career was a contradiction. While critics praised his sheer physical intensity on screen, Women in Love, The Devils, The Brood, his off-screen presence kept setting the house on fire. Literally, once. He set his own house ablaze during a drinking session. The stories are endless and not particularly charming when you read them sober. A walk-off during Castaway, a naked run through a hotel, a TV appearance that ended with a fist fight and a headline. He wasn't just drinking, he was committing to it. And yet, somehow, people tolerated it for decades. Because for a long time, Oliver Reed was money. He was part of a generation of British actors for whom excess wasn't just allowed, it was practically a tax write-off. He wasn't so much enabled as he was packaged that way. The drinking was the brand, and the chaos came with the label. Until it didn't. By the 80s and 90s, Reed was increasingly seen as uninsurable, a word that says more about how the industry views you than any review ever could. His death in 1999 came during a break from filming Gladiator, where he'd been staging an unexpected comeback. He was 61. By then, his liver had done more acting than he had in years. It wasn't scandalous, it was just inevitable. The drink had finally finished the role it had been rehearsing his entire life. But Reed's legacy remains bizarrely magnetic. Like watching an old warship rust in the harbor. Broken, outdated, yet somehow still noble. There's something bleakly poetic about a man who couldn't live within the system of the very art that gave him his voice. And as the bar tab of his life closed for good, it left behind a kind of spiritual hangover for anyone still romanticizing the wild man mythos. Then again, if Reed was the performance of chaos, Richard Burton was its Shakespearean rewrite. Proof that you could have all the words in the world and still drink yourself into silence. 2. Richard Burton. Richard Burton was the kind of actor who made Shakespeare sound like street talk, and street talk sound like prophecy. But behind the velvet voice and the eyes that always seemed to be half remembering a war, there was a man collapsing in slow motion. His demons weren't backstage. They were in his trailer, drinking with him. If Oliver Reed was chaos in motion, Burton was chaos in mourning. Mourning something even he couldn't name. At his peak, Burton was untouchable. Cleopatra, Virginia Woolf, the spy who came in from the cold. He was commanding, magnetic, terrifyingly intelligent. He could play kings, poets, monsters, and husbands on the verge of collapse. Sometimes all at once. But when the camera stopped rolling, the man with the most articulate baritone in Britain often couldn't speak clearly at all. By the 1970s, his alcoholism had turned from rumor into routine. Entire productions were shaped around his sobriety, or lack of it. He showed up drunk. He forgot lines. He slept through call times. His liver was reportedly so damaged by the end that it had become part of his press kit. He tried more than once to get clean, but sobriety didn't stick. Maybe because the world around him didn't want it to. Burton had become a brand, a commodity soaked in whiskey, married to Elizabeth Taylor, brilliant, tragic tabloid gold. His flaws were monetized, his suffering televised. The cruel irony? He knew. He saw through the machinery, understood the game, read his journals, and you'll find someone painfully self-aware. He referred to himself as a man who gives the impression of knowing everything but really knows nothing. That's not self-pity. That's autobiography in disguise. By the time he died in 1984 at 58, the obituaries didn't even have to hint at alcohol. They just said, of course. The damage was visible, audible, and oddly still beautiful. Because Burton, even in decay, gave us performances that felt like eulogies in real time. He was dying for years and letting us watch. And that's the uncomfortable gift he left behind. But Burton's tragedy wasn't in being destroyed. It was in being visible while it happened. Which makes what happened to Ian Hendry all the more haunting. Because Hendry didn't go out under a spotlight. He vanished behind a closed door, and nobody noticed until it was too late. 2 stories in, and already the cracks beneath the glamour are starting to show. If you're still with us, now's a good time to hit that subscribe button. These are the kinds of stories we tell. Quiet tragedies behind loud applause. And tell us, where in the world are you watching from? What time is it right now? Are you drifting off, or wide awake and wondering how it all went so wrong? 3. Ian Hendry. There was a moment, brief, blink and you'll miss it, when Ian Hendry was set to become one of the greats. Before the suave super spy persona was ever stamped onto Patrick Macnee in The Avengers, it was Hendry leading the show. He had that rare kind of presence, grounded but magnetic, a little storm cloud behind the eyes. And then, slowly, and then very quickly, it all slipped. Hendry's story isn't loud. It's not gilded with scandal or tabloid frenzy. There's no explosive downfall, just erosion, a slow undoing. He began the 1960s as a leading man and ended the 1970s in debt, disheveled, and quietly desperate. The difference wasn't talent. He had plenty. It was the bottle. Not in an operatic public meltdown kind of way, but in the quiet, relentless way that wears a man down like water over stone. By all accounts, Hendry struggled with alcohol throughout his adult life. Directors noticed. Colleagues whispered. Eventually, producers stopped calling. The man who once held his own beside Sean Connery and Michael Caine was now showing up late, slurring lines, or not showing up at all. His finances crumbled alongside his reputation. Bankruptcy was filed. Roles dried up. And in 1984, at just 53, Ian Hendry died after a long decline that almost no one in the industry wanted to talk about. He didn't burn out, he faded out, which is somehow harder to watch. And yet, the work is still there, if you go looking. The Hill, Get Carter, Repulsion. You can see the spark, the control, the kind of unforced realism that British cinema briefly treasured before commercialism steamrolled everything. But it's always tinged with something, regret maybe, or the creeping suspicion that this man had already seen his future and knew it didn't end well. What's unsettling is how easily Hendry was forgotten. When he died, there were obituaries, but not many. No glossy retrospectives, no cultural re-evaluation, just silence. He didn't leave behind a myth, just an uncomfortable question. How many careers die quietly because dysfunction doesn't make a good headline? Still, if Hendry was a warning ignored, then Michael Elphick was the next one people should have seen coming, and still didn't. 4. Michael Elphick. Michael Elphick didn't look like a leading man, and maybe that was part of his appeal. He looked real, grizzled, weather-beaten, someone who'd seen things and wasn't going to sugarcoat the story. On British TV, that made him a kind of working-class icon. You didn't expect polish, you expected truth. And then, over time, you got too much of it. He first made his mark with Boone, a gentle detective series where he played the rugged ex-fireman Ken Boone with a battered charm. It ran for years and made him a household name. But even while the show was at its peak, those closest to him knew the actor behind the screen was fighting something far more complex. Elphick was an alcoholic, openly, dangerously, and for a very long time. His drinking wasn't a phase. It was a companion. And the problem wasn't just the volume, it was the constancy. Friends described him as someone whose system simply couldn't go without it. And unlike the controlled chaos of other hellraisers, Elphick's addiction didn't come with anecdotes. It came with silence, with lost jobs, with collapsing health, with a kind of permanent exhaustion that settled into his face on camera. By the late 90s, the spark had dimmed. He kept working sporadically, including a notable stint on EastEnders, but even that was cut short. He wasn't reliable enough anymore. The same industry that once embraced his rough-edged realism slowly began to step away. And in 2002, he was found dead at the age of 55. Officially, it was heart failure. Unofficially, the cause had been in plain sight for decades. What makes Elphick's story linger is its ordinariness. This wasn't a meteoric rise and fall. It was a man slowly breaking down in front of an audience that didn't know whether to intervene or just keep watching. And many did just keep watching. Addiction isn't always loud. Sometimes it's just routine. The same drink at the same pub with the same excuses. Until the rolls stop coming. The phone stops ringing. And the only thing left is the echo of a character people loved but a man they never really knew. But for Tony Hancock, the breakdown wasn't hidden in the background. It was front and center, stitched into every performance, every pause, every punchline that landed just a little too close to the truth. 5. Tony Hancock. Tony Hancock had timing. Not just the kind that makes jokes land, but the kind that makes silence unbearable. Watch Hancock's half hour today and you'll see it. The pauses, the glances, the almost whispered line deliveries that hang in the air just a beat too long. He made discomfort into comedy. But off-screen, that same discomfort was eating him alive. In the 1950s, Hancock was Britain's king of comedy. His BBC radio and television shows helped redefine British humor. Dry, neurotic, painfully self-aware. A new kind of character, the little man fighting the system. But the man playing that role wasn't pretending. Tony Hancock was the character. Brilliant, resentful, alone. As his fame grew, so did the pressure. Hancock didn't just want laughs. He wanted respect. He saw himself as a serious artist trapped in a clown's body, and that friction lit a fire under his career, and eventually burned through it. He left his writers. He left his longtime co-star, Sid James. He left the formula that had made him famous. He thought he could do it alone. The trouble was, he couldn't. By the early 1960s, the cracks were undeniable. He was drinking heavily. He struggled to complete performances. He became obsessed with his public image, with his failures, with what people thought of him. When his later shows received lukewarm reviews, he internalized every word. His comedy turned brittle. The silences stopped being funny. Tony Hancock's relationship with alcohol wasn't subtle. Colleagues and friends spoke of it openly in the years that followed. Late-night binges, missed rehearsals, emotional outbursts. His final years were spent in Australia, trying to restart his career. Far from the BBC, far from the spotlight, and far from stable. He died in 1968. His final notes reportedly soaked in disappointment rather than drama. What makes Hancock's story sting is that you can still hear the pain in his jokes. That voice, so carefully tuned to self-deprecation, was always just an inch away from self-destruction. He was ahead of his time, but that didn't save him. The industry loved what he gave them, but not enough to figure out how to give anything back. And yet, next to Hancock's brittle despair, Kenneth Williams brought something even more enigmatic to the table. A life lived in public, a death cloaked in question marks, and a personal script that no one's quite managed to decode. 6. Kenneth Williams. Kenneth Williams spoke like a trumpet, bright, blaring, impossible to ignore. Whether playing campy caricatures in the Carry-On films or delivering cutting one-liners on radio panel shows, he was pure presence. You didn't watch Kenneth Williams. You were ambushed by him. But for someone so flamboyantly loud in public, his private life was near silent. Controlled. Hidden. Obsessed over. He kept diaries, millions of words worth, recording everything, especially his own unhappiness. In those pages, the man behind the mask slowly emerges. Lonely, anxious, constantly in pain, both physical and emotional, and increasingly reliant on prescription medication to get through the days. By the 1970s, Williams was a national institution. The British public loved him, sort of. They loved the performance, the double entendres, the nasal laugh, but the real Williams never quite fit anywhere. Not in the comedy world, which valued accessibility over introspection. Not in the gay community, which he kept at a polite distance. And not in his own skin, which he frequently described in his diaries as a source of embarrassment, disgust, and contradiction. He suffered from chronic back pain for much of his adult life and was prescribed barbiturates, common at the time, even when poorly monitored. Friends later noted that his dependency grew quietly but persistently. Combine that with long-term isolation, emotional repression, and a brutal inner critic, and you get a man slowly losing grip on the scaffolding he'd built around himself. When Williams died in 1988, the official inquest recorded an open verdict. The cause was a barbiturate overdose, but no one could say for sure whether it was accidental. And in a way, that uncertainty mirrors the man himself. Nothing ever quite added up. He was too intelligent to play dumb, too proud to ask for help, too famous to be anonymous, and too private to be truly known. His final diary entry read, "Oh, what's the bloody point?" Depending on your angle, it's either a tragic coda or a punchline he never got to deliver. Maybe both. That was his genius. Always standing at the threshold between comedy and catastrophe. And if Kenneth Williams held the door open between public joy and private despair, Sid James was already halfway through it, smiling, gambling, drinking, joking, all the while heading straight for the collapse. 7. Sid James. Sid James had a laugh that sounded like it had been boiled in whiskey and left out in the sun. Dirty, infectious, instantly recognizable. It was a laugh that practically was British comedy during the post-war years. A grin wrapped in a wheeze, dressed in innuendo, delivered with the weariness of a man who'd seen too much and still wanted more. On screen, he was the eternal chancer, a woman chaser, a backroom schemer, the cheeky bloke from down the pub who always had one more story to tell. Off-screen, the lines blurred more than anyone wanted to admit. Born in South Africa and trained in the kind of grit you can't fake, James found success relatively late. His rise through Hancock's Half Hour and later the Carry-On films made him a beloved fixture of British TV and cinema. He wasn't a matinee idol. He wasn't meant to be. He was something more durable, the face of working-class comedy, of bawdy postcards come to life. He gave the audience what they wanted, especially when what they wanted was to forget the cold, gray reality outside the theater. But the laughter came at a cost. Behind the curtain, Sid James lived in a world filled with chaos and coping mechanisms. Alcohol was a constant companion, and his gambling habit was more than a casual flutter. It was a deep, gnawing compulsion that left him financially unstable despite decades of success. His personal life was tumultuous, with affairs, debts, and professional frustrations piling up behind the scenes. People called it living life to the full, But full isn't always the same as fulfilled. Health issues began to shadow him in the 1970s. The laughing rogue image started to look more like a mask stretched too tight. And then came the end, sudden and devastating. In 1976, during a live stage performance of the mating season, Sid James collapsed on stage. The audience reportedly laughed, thinking it was part of the act. It wasn't. He never got up again. His death shocked the public, but in hindsight, it seemed almost inevitable. A man who lives so loudly, so constantly, so desperately eventually runs out of breath. The industry didn't quite know how to mourn him, partly because it never really understood him. Or maybe it just didn't want to. Because while Sid James made a career out of turning chaos into comedy, Peter Cook turned it into something stranger, something colder, sharper, and ultimately more destructive. 8. Peter Cook. Peter Cook didn't just break the mold, he set it on fire and then told the audience it was their fault. He was one of the few people in British comedy history who could make a room full of intellectuals feel stupid and make stupid people feel like geniuses. And he did both with the same line. Cook was the architect of modern British satire, the man behind Beyond the Fringe, not only, but also, and a dozen other pieces of cultural dynamite that redefined what comedy could be. He was wit personified, and he was also drinking himself to death for most of his adult life. There's a cruel irony in watching someone so sharp dull themselves down over time. In his 20s, Cook was incandescent. He didn't write jokes. He dismantled reality and rebuilt it with sarcasm and venom. He helped invent the modern sketch show. He founded Private Eye, the satirical magazine still going today. He was, by all accounts, a genius. And by all accounts, he didn't care. Friends noticed the decline long before the public did. The drinking was never social. It was constant. He became famously unreliable. Sketches were missed. Meetings forgotten. Partnerships, like his brilliant pairing with Dudley Moore, strained and eventually broke under the weight of his indifference and intoxication. The tragedy was that Peter Cook knew what he was doing. He saw the wreckage, and he leaned into it. By the 1980s, the man who once stormed stages with a revolutionary gleam in his eye was now a sporadic presence on panel shows and talk shows, slurring through appearances that left audiences confused more than entertained. He was, in many ways, a ghost haunting his own reputation. He still had flashes of brilliance. He could still deliver a cutting one-liner with surgical precision. But the edge had dulled. The fire had dimmed. When he died in 1995 from a gastrointestinal hemorrhage related to years of drinking, there was a collective sense of sadness, not just at his passing, but at the waste. Peter Cook had more talent in his hangover than most comedians have in their entire careers. But he never seemed interested in using it to its full extent. Or maybe he just didn't believe the world deserved it. And yet, even at his most self-destructive, he left behind something immortal. Which makes the story of Graham Chapman, Cook's spiritual cousin in both brilliance and burnout, all the more sobering. Because Chapman didn't just fight with himself. He fought with his body, his mind, and the audience who laughed without knowing what it cost. 9. Graham Chapman. Graham Chapman never quite fit into the box labeled comedian. He was too unpredictable, too sharp, too inwardly disjointed to ever fully settle into the mold the public wanted for him. As one of the founding members of Monty Python, Chapman helped rewrite the language of television comedy. Absurd, intellectual, anarchic. He could go from playing a deadpan military officer to a man who thinks he's a lemur, and somehow it all made perfect sense. But behind the surreal brilliance was a man quietly, and then very publicly, battling an addiction that nearly erased him before he had the chance to be understood. Chapman's drinking didn't follow the usual arc. He was already drinking heavily before Monty Python took off. By the time Monty Python and the Holy Grail was in production, the cast and crew had begun building a buffer around him, scheduling scenes around his more lucid hours, finding polite ways to work around missed cues and memory lapses. He could be razor-sharp one moment and completely unreachable the next. John Cleese later admitted that much of the troupe had no idea how bad it had gotten until the drinking stopped, and he did stop, eventually. In the late 1970s, Chapman went sober and began speaking openly about alcoholism, even folding elements of his recovery into public appearances. But sobriety came with its own shadows. Chapman remained deeply complex, someone who wore defiance like a badge, but often let vulnerability bleed through the cracks. His memoir, A Liar's Autobiography, walks the line between confession and performance so tightly, it's hard to tell where the truth ends and the comedy begins, which was probably the point. Chapman's death in 1989 at just 48 wasn't directly caused by addiction. It was cancer that took him in the end. But the scars of his earlier battles lingered in every tribute, every reflection. Monty Python's surviving members mourned him with a mixture of grief and absurdity, giving him the kind of send-off only they could. Irreverent, tearful, and entirely inappropriate by normal standards, just as he would have wanted. What lingers about Graham Chapman isn't just the laughter he created, it's the unease underneath it. The sense that for every joke about Spanish Inquisitions or dead parrots, there was a man quietly unraveling behind the curtain. And the tragedy was that by the time he found peace, his time was nearly up. But if Chapman walked the line between brilliance and breakdown with a wink and a script, Robert Newton charged through it like a man trying to outrun his own legend, drunk on success, drowning in consequence. 10. Robert Newton. Before pirates became Johnny Depp and eyeliner, they were Robert Newton in full throttle. If you've ever heard someone yell "R" with a mangled West Country accent, you're hearing Newton. He practically invented the pop culture pirate voice, thanks to his roaring performance as Long John Silver in Disney's Treasure Island. But Newton's life was far less romantic than the caricature he unintentionally created. In fact, it was shaped, and eventually shattered, by the very excess his characters seemed to celebrate. In the 1940s and early 50s, Newton was British film royalty. Roles in Oliver Twist, This Happy Breed, and Odd Man Out showcased a serious, versatile actor with the kind of presence that made producers forgive more than they should have. Because even at the height of his fame, Newton's drinking was not a secret. It was a professional liability hiding behind a profitable reputation. Stories from sets speak of scenes delayed, lines forgotten, tempers flared. He was magnetic on screen, and a minefield off it. But he kept getting cast. Because like many on this list, Newton belonged to a generation of actors whose destructive behaviors were seen as unfortunate side effects of genius. For every missed cue, there was a towering performance. For every scandal, there was a hit film. Until there wasn't. By the mid-1950s, the jobs had slowed, the money had run dry, and Newton was bouncing between the UK, Hollywood, and Australia, looking for roles, for stability, maybe for a version of himself he could live with. He died in 1956, at just 50 years old. Officially, the cause was a heart attack. Unofficially, it was everything that came before it. Years of alcohol abuse, stress, and declining health. By the end, he was broke, semi-forgotten, and far from the star he'd once been. But the irony is that Newton's legacy survived in the most cartoonish form imaginable. Kids still talk like his Long John Silver, unaware that the voice came from a man steadily unraveling behind the scenes. His story is a cautionary tale in theatrical form, a swashbuckler who couldn't steer the ship. A larger-than-life figure who spent his final years shrinking into obscurity. And if Newton died sailing into myth, then George Sanders left behind something colder. A resignation letter to the world, written with perfect grammar and a total absence of sentiment. 11. George Sanders. George Sanders had the voice of a man who had already decided he was smarter than you. Smooth, bored, impeccably articulated. He played villains, aristocrats, and sardonic intellectuals with the same amused detachment. Whether in Rebecca, All About Eve, or one of his many suave thrillers, Sanders gave the impression of someone watching the world from a balcony, mildly entertained and profoundly unimpressed. But that elegant distance wasn't just an acting choice. It was a worldview, and eventually, it became a trap. Sanders' life was a long negotiation with disillusionment. Born into privilege, educated, cultured, and effortlessly articulate, he always seemed to be playing a role, even when the cameras weren't on. He was a star during Hollywood's golden age, winning an Oscar for All About Eve, and he had everything that came with it: money, fame, and a string of high-profile relationships. Yet none of it appeared to move him very much. In interviews and later writings, he often described himself as weary of people, weary of work, and weary of life's repetition. In the later years, that weariness deepened. Sanders became increasingly dependent on prescription sedatives, barbiturates that were widely used at the time for sleep and anxiety. They weren't treated as dangerous then in the way we understand now. They were simply part of the mid-century celebrity toolkit, as common as cigarettes and martinis. But for someone already steeped in cynicism and emotional detachment, they offered a quiet kind of escape that was all too easy to lean on. When Sanders died in 1972, he left behind a note that was as perfectly phrased as one of his movie monologues: polite, distant, and chillingly final. It wasn't dramatic, it was resigned. That, more than anything, is what made it unsettling. This was not a man overtaken by chaos. This was a man who calmly stepped away from the table. The public reacted with confusion. How could someone so successful, so admired, so outwardly composed, simply choose to leave? But if you listen closely to Sanders' screen persona, the answer was always there. He had built an entire career on the idea that nothing was worth taking seriously for too long. Eventually, that philosophy turned inward. And if Sanders was defined by his elegant detachment, Dudley Moore was the opposite. A man whose warmth and talent lit up every room, even as he quietly struggled to keep his own life from going dim. 12. Dudley Moore. Dudley Moore was a contradiction wrapped in a grin, a classically trained pianist who became a comedy icon, a small man with a huge screen presence, a sharp satirist who somehow radiated innocence even while delivering cutting jokes. From not only, but also with Peter Cook to his global breakthrough in Arthur, Moore seemed to embody a kind of joyful cleverness that made audiences feel like everything was going to be all right as long as he was around. But behind the laughter was a more complicated story. Moore had long struggled with alcohol, even during his early successes in Britain. By the time he moved to Hollywood in the 1970s, the pressure of fame and the isolation of life in the spotlight only made things harder. His drinking was well known in industry circles. It didn't always stop him from working, but it shaped how people saw him. Roles became harder to land. Reputations, once damaged, tend to stick. For a while, Moore managed to get sober, and those periods of clarity showed just how brilliant he really was. He could move effortlessly between comedy and drama, between music and acting. But later in life, a cruel twist of fate added a new layer of misunderstanding. Moore developed a rare neurological condition that affected his balance, speech, and coordination. To the public, it looked like relapse. To those who knew him, it was something far more tragic, a body slowly betraying a mind that was still fully awake. This overlap between a history of addiction and the symptoms of illness created a painful confusion that followed him to the end of his career. He was often judged harshly for things that were no longer within his control. The man who once dazzled audiences with perfect timing and musical precision now struggled to be taken seriously at all. Dudley Moore died in 2002, remembered fondly but often misunderstood. His legacy is one of immense talent and quiet resilience, overshadowed by a narrative that never quite caught up to the truth. He was never just the lovable drunk on screen. He was a deeply gifted artist fighting two invisible battles at once. And as Moore's story shows how easily perception can distort reality, the next chapter, Caroline Aherne, reveals how even a beloved national treasure can suffer in silence while the world keeps laughing. 13. Caroline Aherne. Caroline Aherne was the kind of comedian who could disarm a room without raising her voice. She didn't need to chase the laugh. She let it come to her, like an old friend dropping by unannounced. Her characters were iconic. The arch, passive-aggressive host of the Mrs. Merton show, the beautifully mundane Denise in the royal family, the voice behind half the country's favorite punchlines in the 90s. But beneath the deadpan wit and working-class realism was someone for whom comedy was a shield, and eventually a burden. Aherne's appeal wasn't just that she was funny, it was that she understood. Her sketches didn't mock so much as observe, subtle, lived in, full of silences that said more than the jokes. She was the rare performer who could make a nation laugh without ever once appearing to try too hard. But off-screen, she was fighting battles the public never saw clearly at the time. Alcohol became one of her coping tools early in her career. Like many in British comedy, Aherne worked in environments where drinking wasn't just common, it was expected. A writer-performer in the vein of Victoria Wood and Alan Bennett, she came up in a culture that romanticized tortured creativity, especially if it was wrapped in sharp one-liners and working-class charm. But Aherne's drinking wasn't glamorous, and it wasn't theatrical. It was something quieter, more insidious, often hidden, often denied, and often misread by the very industry that depended on her genius. The tabloids, predictably, zeroed in on her most vulnerable moments. A stint in rehab became a headline. Her periods of withdrawal from public life were interpreted as eccentricity or diva behavior. But behind the headlines was a person struggling not just with addiction, but with chronic illness and personal grief. Few knew the full extent of what she was carrying, nor did many ask. Even as her health declined, Aherne kept writing, kept performing. Her final works, especially the royal family specials, carried a deepening emotional weight, still funny, still understated, but now laced with something harder to name, a kind of knowing, a kind of goodbye. She died in 2016 at the age of 52, having lived more privately than most public figures of her stature. In the tributes that followed, a new clarity emerged. Aherne hadn't just made Britain laugh, she'd held up a mirror to its quiet sadness. And in doing so, she joined a lineage of comic talents undone by pain no one could quite see. Which brings us inevitably to Peter Finch, a man whose talent earned him late-life glory, even as his personal habits quietly laid the groundwork for a sudden and irreversible ending. 14. Peter Finch. Peter Finch never quite played by the rules. Not in life, not in acting, not even in death. A brooding, intense presence on screen, Finch brought a restless energy to every role, whether it was a stoic Australian farmer, a conflicted lover, or the prophetic broadcaster who screamed, "I'm mad as hell," in Network. But behind the charisma was a man chasing something, perhaps greatness, perhaps escape, perhaps just the next drink. Finch came up through the British and Australian theater scenes, never fully belonging to either. He wasn't the kind of actor who coasted on charm. He went deep. Too deep sometimes. His performances had a rawness to them that made critics swoon and directors nervous. You didn't cast Peter Finch to play it safe, you cast him to make the walls shake. But that intensity carried over off-set, where Finch developed a reputation for hard living that followed him for most of his adult life. Alcohol was part of the mythos. He was often described as hard drinking, which in mid-century acting circles was code for brilliant but unpredictable. Friends and colleagues would later say it was just part of who he was, charming one minute, withdrawn the next, burning through both relationships and roles with a kind of reckless grace. His vices were tolerated, even celebrated, because the performances kept coming. And they were good. Too good to interrupt. It wasn't until the very end that Finch finally reached the peak his talent had always deserved. Network became a cultural phenomenon, and Finch's performance, unhinged, magnetic, unforgettable, won him the posthumous Oscar. But he never got to see it. Just days after filming a series of high-profile interviews and award season appearances, he collapsed and died of a heart attack at the age of 60. The public reaction was one of shock, but not surprise. Those close to him had seen the toll. Years of stress, travel, and indulgence had quietly drained his reserves. By the time the world acknowledged his brilliance, it was already too late. Peter Finch died at the height of his power, leaving behind a legacy that feels both complete and unfinished. A man who lived just long enough to give the performance of his career and not a moment longer. And then there's Paul Danan, the last name on this list. A man whose story didn't unfold in smoky theaters or classic film sets, but in tabloids, reality shows, and rehab centers. A modern tragedy, shaped not by myth, but by the cold indifference of spectacle. 15. Paul Danan. Paul Danan didn't come from the old studio system or the smoky club circuit of British comedy. He came from something colder and louder. The late 1990s television machine that could turn a young face into a national obsession in a single season and discard it just as quickly. When he joined Hollyoaks in 1997, he became exactly what that era demanded. A heartthrob with a soft edge, recognizable enough to sell magazines, and relatable enough to be invited into people's living rooms every evening. For a while, it worked. Fame came fast. Too fast. What no one teaches you about sudden celebrity is how lonely it is. Danan was barely out of his teens when the attention hit, and the pressure to stay visible, desirable, and relevant was relentless. When the script slowed, the tabloids sped up. Every relationship, every stumble, every rumor became content. For someone already wrestling with insecurity and anxiety, it was a dangerous environment. Substances entered his life, substances, not as rebellion, but as relief. An off switch in a world that never stopped watching. Unlike many on this list, Danan's struggles played out in real time, on reality television and in interviews. He was unusually honest about his addiction, his relapses, and his attempts to get well. But honesty doesn't always lead to understanding. More often, it turned into entertainment. His vulnerability became part of the spectacle. Rehab stays were reported like plot twists. Setbacks were treated like cliffhangers. The public learned his story in fragments, never quite seeing the whole picture. Over the years, Danan tried again and again to rebuild. He went into treatment multiple times. He spoke openly about how much money he'd spent trying to get better, how much of himself he'd lost along the way. But recovery is not a straight line, especially when the outside world keeps pulling you back into the same patterns. Fame doesn't leave says no notes on your door. It just waits. When Danan died in 2025, the headlines were blunt, clinical, and strangely detached. Substances were listed. Circumstances were summarized. A life that had once been front-page news was reduced to a few cold paragraphs. For those who had followed his story, it felt both shocking and heartbreakingly familiar. He had been fighting for so long that exhaustion seemed like part of the narrative. Paul Danan's tragedy wasn't that he failed, it was that he kept trying in a system that had no patience for slow healing. He was never just a cautionary tale. He was a person caught in the machinery of modern celebrity, where pain is content and recovery is inconvenient. And so the list ends not with a mythic figure from black and white cinema or a comedy legend from the BBC's golden years, but with someone who lived and struggled in full color under the harshest light imaginable. Which leaves a final uncomfortable question hanging in the air. How many more stories just like his are quietly being written right now while the audience keeps scrolling, waiting for the next one to fall?